one of the most famous battles in history. A surprise attack by the Japanese on the American fleet at Pearl Harbor on the Pacific island of Oahu 80 years ago. Within 2 hours, 5 battleships had been sunk, another 16 damaged and 188 aircraft destroyed. Nearly 2,500 Americans killed. And the next day, the US declared war on Japan and entered into World War II.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
But what happened that day had ramifications as well for thousands of Japanese living in the US. All of a sudden, they were seen as the enemy. And 2 months later, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the incarceration of all persons of Japanese origin suspected of being traitors. In the end, nearly 120,000 deported to so-called resettlement camps, entire families locked up behind barbed wire for up to 3 years. Well, national security was given as the reason for the policy, even though it violated the constitutional rights of those detained. Although they were prisoners, those inside did their best to live normal lives, starting markets and schooling their children. It's estimated that detainees lost some $400 million during their incarceration. And 40 years on, $20,000 was approved by Congress for every person detained. But what now of those who lost so much? Well, Valérie Defer, Pierrick Laurent and Ryan Thompson revisit the story for us here on France 24.
It took me a lot of years to return to Manzanar. It brings back memories. My mother took me around the camp and took me to the fence and said, never, ever try to go outside the fence. I was looking at this guard, and he sort of pointed the rifle at us. You know, I understood eventually this was a prison, and we were only here because of our race. And so in this place, 10,000 people who did absolutely nothing, being prisoners of the only country we knew.
My name is Amy Sakamoto TSUBOKAWA, and I was 9 years old when I entered the camp.
Amy and John are some of the last living witnesses telling the story of a period America would rather not talk about. A response to the Second World War that still has visible traces in the open prairies of California and Arizona.
Oh yeah, it's this one here. And there I am right there.
Amy lived within these barbed wire confines until she was 12 years old.
They call it the relocation center. Yeah, we were relocated, you know. But the official word that most of the Japanese use today, it was a concentration camp. But it was still places where we could not escape.
The fact is, you did escape. You did come out, and you made something of your life.
Yeah, yeah.
The story begins in California, the night before the Second World War. 120,000 people of Japanese origin lived on the west coast of the US at the time, but after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, their fate changed.
Well, it's wartime. If they saw us as Japanese, then they would think that we were all spies, you know.
US President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the incarceration of all those considered potential enemies. The next day, in the Japanese neighborhoods of Los Angeles, the U.S. military put up deportation announcements. John's family had to leave everything behind.
They had 24 hours to leave everything behind and report. And the sign said you can only bring what you could carry. And so all families came with arms full, suitcases, and anything they thought they would need.
When you're transported to someplace else that you don't know, you are scared. You're afraid of what it is that's going to happen to you.
There were trainfuls of Japanese people being sent out there.
The train passed through the Sierra Nevada mountains. But it was only after the arrival that families understood what awaited them, a wasteland of desert for as far as the eye can see. Beth and her son Tristan took a 5-hour flight to Manzanar.
I kind of feel like it's something that the United States hasn't really addressed too much, because I think a lot of people nowadays don't really know the names of any of the internment camps that the United States had during World War II.
I feel totally ashamed, and I feel like I consider myself relatively educated. I am a teacher, granted I teach 3rd grade, and I had no clue this exists.
Each camp looks like a prison. Across 3 square kilometers, 500 barracks were hastily built by the U.S. military, but all were surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. John, his 3 brothers, his parents, and his grandfather lived in a 45 square meter room for 3 years, furnished with only cots and a charcoal stove.
This is the typical kind of room we had, where there were cots for as many people in the family or in the unit. When you went to sleep, you put the blanket over your head, because in the morning there would be a fairly substantial layer of dust.
Just surviving in that heat, 116 in the summertime, it goes down to freezing. And we would find ice, in the wintertime over those little puddles of water.
My memory of Manzanar is always the wind and always the dust.
Today, thanks to the efforts of survivors, Manzanar has achieved the status of a National Historic Site. Patricia is one of the guides telling its story. 100,000 visitors come each year to see a reconstruction of living conditions at the time.
This is the women's latrine. We rebuilt this on the original foundation. There were 2 rows like this, 5 toilets each. And this is the lack of privacy that people talked about. The Army really didn't give any thought to the humanity. It was just military operations. The people were seen as just something to be moved.
3 years after the camps were created, a court ruling declared that the incarceration of American citizens was illegal. On November 21st, 1945, the government announced the closure of the 10 Japanese-American internment camps. Each family received a modest sum of $25 to rebuild their life. For John's mom, it was a relief to be free at last.
I never heard her and my father complain, ever, while we were in camp. This old philosophy, just keep going forward. There were nights where I knew she was crying. But, as a kid, what do you do with that? And I think in my own personal case, it's just absorb it and bury it deep.
My father died in camp. They took him to the hospital because he collapsed. And he died 3 days later. And so at that time, they don't have big funerals or anything, but everybody came, So it was a difficult time for us as family. And here she was, a widow now with 5 little children.
a traumatic experience that few want to talk about.
Ooh, I feel very emotional because I'm 70 years old and I never heard those stories. I mean, you can imagine what that is, but I never heard it from her mouth.
We did not speak of our experience because it was such a shameful part of our lives. And we said, we have to go on. We're going to be American citizens and we're going to do the best we can.
When the families of John and Amy returned to Los Angeles, they were not welcomed with open arms.
There was a lot of restrictions on where we could live. It was segregation. We had to abandon everything culturally that made us Japanese. So we stopped speaking the language and we became as white American as we could, to the point that we forgot how to speak Japanese. And that was the price we paid for trying to become American again.
Many years later, John is now leading the campaign for reparations from the U.S. government.
It was racist. There were no Japanese Americans ever found guilty of any crimes against the government, and yet the entire population was imprisoned.
46 years after the horror, an official apology from then-President Ronald Reagan and compensation were offered.
We must recognize that the internment of Japanese Americans was just that, a mistake. Here, we admit a wrong.
There's insects in here flying too. Oh, that's terrible. Oh my, it needs restoration. Oh, there's holes in the roof too. Oh.
In Arizona, far from public view and memory, the POSTON camp is today abandoned.
It's just a reminder of some people were here, and unless it's here, you can't tell the story. And people like me who have lived in this area during that war, that we will be gone. And if the monuments aren't here, who's going to tell the story?
My name is MARLENE SHIGEKAWA, and I was born here in POSTON, October 23rd, 1944. This elementary school site from Camp 1 is all that's left of the whole POSTON incarceration site.
For more than 10 years, Marlene and Barbara, a volunteer architect, have been fighting to preserve this site, which is steeped in history.
Urgency is there, and every time I come out, I see a little more deterioration. Like this building, most of the buildings have these stud walls put in to help support the roof so that even if the walls collapse, the roof won't collapse too. We won't have a total building collapse. So this gives us time to raise money to preserve the buildings.
Unlike Manzanar, the POSTON camp has not received support or funding from the National Parks Agency.
So look how rotted this is.
Yucky, yeah.
And I would think that out here you'd have an issue with termites.
The restoration of everything is estimated to eventually cost $3 million.
Our goal here is to return the buildings to what they looked like when it was part of the internment site.
If we had the funding, I could see it happening within 2 or 3 years. That would be the best case scenario, right?
Yeah,
And
we're
we
all
get
getting older. We all want to see this
right.
done.
Because it's so important to American history, and there's so little knowledge available, you know, in our history books.
This dark chapter in American history is in many cases only a single paragraph in textbooks.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being in class today. How are you?
At the University of Southern California, Susan Kamei has created the first course dedicated to Japanese American internment camps.
The FBI agents had maps, and my dad remembers seeing the map with dots on it,
and where the Japanese families lived.
The daughter of a survivor herself, she explains in detail the legal process that resulted in the incarceration of 120,000 people for 3 years.
There wasn't a course that looked at things comprehensively in terms of not just what happened in camp, as important as that is, but what happened to their lives afterwards, and then to bring it to the relevance today. So that's what I thought the real opportunity of the course was.
These students identify the loopholes in the U.S. Constitution to prevent a similar violation of civil rights from happening ever again.
The law is not static, it's dynamic. It can be manipulated for good or for worse to harm people in this country.
Policies even now discriminate against people of color. And so I think this class does, teach you that, yeah, it can happen, and in some respects it is happening, and we need to call it out. And as a country, we can't settle for that.
When you drive through the reservation, you can kind of see, if you know what you're looking for, you can kind of say, oh, that's a barrack, that's a barrack.
After World War II, the government sold the POSTON barracks back to the local Native American community. Marlene and Barbara now roam the region in search of remains that they are trying to save.
Do you think these are the original windows?
Yes. Yeah.
That's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, this is pretty intact. This is more intact than any we've seen.
We wanted to relocate it closer to the POSTON monument and create an interpretive center.
It would be set up as a barrack, a living quarters, and you would see the wood floors, you would see the cots, and you walk from an air-conditioned interpretive space into this blast furnace so that people really understand what it was like as internees to live here.
A dream which, if it comes to fruition, may prevent POSTON's camp from fading into the oblivion.
Valérie Delphin, Pierrick Laurent and Ryan Thompson revisiting the aftermath of Pearl Harbor here on France 24. That's all for this week's edition. Don't forget, of course, you can catch it and the previous editions as well on the website at france24.com. More news coming up shortly. Thanks for watching.